Power Apps notifications are typically sent to users using the notify function, but there's not really much we can do in terms of styling and modifying that notification bar. In this video, we're going to look at recreating the Fluent 2 React message bar component, which gives us exciting new ways to send modern on-screen notifications to our users. These notifications will allow them to take action from our notification, such as linking to external content or performing other operations inside our app. We'll also build this keeping responsive design principles in mind, so that our component can be used on any screen size. Let's take a look. Looking at the Fluent 2 documentation, we learn that the message bar control communicates important information about the state of the app or a subcomponent in the app, such as a container, a form, a dialog, a card, or a table. It's important to note that the messages are typically not used for destructive actions, such as deleting a record. In those scenarios, a dialog component would typically be used. We've covered the Fluent 2 dialog control previously on the channel, so be sure to check out that video in the upper right corner. There are 4 types of messages in the message bar, which correspond to the 4 notification types that we currently have in Power Apps. First is the info type, which communicates helpful but non-time sensitive information to the user. Links and buttons are usually optional for an info message. The success message bar communicates that something went right on the screen or in the app. An example of this would be a success message when a user submits a form, prompting them to do something else in the app. Links and buttons are also optional for this type. Warnings are typically orange and communicate possible issue items to a user. In the case of Power Apps, these issues would be things like an incomplete record being submitted, issues with a flow runs response, or a maximum number of records almost being reached in a data source. Warnings should include a link or a button to help the user prevent a problem from happening in the future. The last type we have are error messages, and these are used when something goes wrong that requires the user to address the issue before they can continue in the app. This could be something like an unsuccessful patch function, a variable being set to blank when it needs a value, or an error in the app being caught by an if-error formula. These should absolutely contain a button or a link to solve the issue, and this is functionality that we currently don't have in the default notify function. Now let's look at guidance on container-level message bars, since this is something that we currently don't have in Power Apps. We're very used to the notify command sending app-level messages, as these always appear at the very top of the screen. With this component, however, we're able to insert a message bar into smaller sections of our app. If used at the container level, the message bar should be placed just below the title or the header of the section. We can also utilize more than one message bar on a screen if we need to communicate messages in multiple containers on one screen. We can also use this same guidance for tab-level messages when combined with the tab list control in Power Apps. Other areas to use a message bar would be in cards if using the modern card component, within a form to show errors or other information about the form, or at the drawer level if using some sort of drawer or sidebar component. When we look at what to actually build in our Power App, there are 5 main controls that make up the content of the message. We have a title message, a message body, a dismiss button, a link, and an action button. In the case of our component today, we'll be including 2 action buttons. The last thing we'll look at in the Fluent 2 documentation is just some guidance on effectively using messages. We want to communicate the main message in our title field. This will help with quick recognition by our users of what has just taken place in our app. For our message body, we should give clear, concise, and actionable information to the user. In other words, this shouldn't just be a repetition of the title, as that isn't useful to the user. Instead, we should give additional context. As with many things, less is more, so we should aim to keep our messages short and roughly about 2 lines of about 100 characters. Since the message bar will never truncate the message's text, we don't want a large message bar to overwhelm our users. For success messages, we want to make sure we're writing something useful. The documentation here calls out something that's pretty common, where we congratulate users on completing an ordinary task. And while that might provide good confirmation to somebody that something is complete, it doesn't do much for keeping the user's momentum and telling them what next steps to take. There's a great example here telling us that our website was created, and although the site is ready to edit, it is invisible until we publish it. That tells us that we're ready to start working, and when we're ready to make it available to our users, we have to take the next step and publish it. With that, I think that's enough background on the documentation for the message bar component, so let's hop over to Power Apps and we'll start to build it. We'll first navigate to our components, and we'll add a new component named Fluent2 Message Bar. We'll start by adding in our custom properties for the message bar component. We'll add a notify property, and this will be an action property with no return data type. This is the main action that our app can call to display a new message to the user. For this, we'll need to add some parameters. The first parameter will be a type parameter, and this will be a required parameter of type number. We'll be able to specify if our message is of the types information, success, warning, or an error message. The next parameter will be a title parameter, and this will be required and represent the main text of our message. We'll set this to the data type of text. Now we can add some optional parameters. These can be used to add more detail to the message and provide inputs for the things like action buttons. The first one we'll add is the message parameter. This will be of type text and represents the additional text displayed in our message. The next optional parameter is duration, and this will allow us to set the length of time that our message is on the screen in milliseconds, similar to how the notify function works in Power Apps. Next, we'll add a link parameter. This will be an optional record parameter, and we'll be able to provide a link title and URL to this parameter in order to display a link to a web page in our message. Next, we'll add an optional parameter for Action 1. This will be a record parameter that allows us to provide a button to our user to take action. We'll also add another optional record parameter, and this will be called Action 2. This will just be a second action button that we can give a choice between the first action and the second one. With our notify property complete, we'll just add two more properties. One is called onSelect, and this will be an event property. We'll add a required parameter for this one called item key. This parameter will be used to tell which button in our message was pressed, and then we can call different actions depending on which button the user selected. Next, we'll add an auto height property. This will be a number output property, and we'll use this to auto adjust the height of our message bar depending on how many messages are inside it. Now with our custom properties created, we can go ahead and set some defaults for these properties. For our notify function, we'll first need to set some defaults for all of the parameters that are found inside the notify function. If we go up to the top left corner of Power Apps, we can scroll down through the list until we see our notify parameters. For the type, we'll go ahead and set this as notification type.information. This is that default gray message bar that we saw in the documentation. For the title, we'll set this as title. For message, we'll go ahead and set this as an empty text value. So we'll just put in 2 quotation marks. For the duration, you can choose a default duration if you decide not to enter a custom duration when calling the notify function. We'll set this to 5,000 for now, and that'll be equivalent to 5 seconds. Again, this number is in milliseconds. For Action 1, we'll go ahead and insert a blank record containing 2 empty text strings for an item key field and an item display name field. This is telling our notify function to expect these 2 values, and since these are optional, the default value will just be 2 blank text values. We'll go ahead and copy the same record to our Action 2 parameter. Finally, we'll go to the link parameter and we'll insert a similar blank record containing 2 fields for link text and link URL. Now that our notify function parameters are done, we'll go ahead and set the default value for the notify property itself. We want to use the collect function to create a collection called col messages. For our record, we'll create a record that ties to each of our parameters found in the notify function. So we'll have a field for type, and this will be mapped to the type parameter. We'll have a field for title, mapped to the title parameter, one for message, mapped to message. Action 1 will be mapped to action 1, and so on and so forth. The final collect function is shown here. For our onSelect function, we'll just set this to a simple switch function. We'll say switch on the item key, and we can insert blank for the matching value and blank again for the result. This will be changed on the actual screen that we insert our control on. Building our component will be a lot easier if we have a message to show in our component as we're building it. Temporarily, we'll enable the Access App Scope option, and that will allow us to collect a message using our notify function, and we can see that while we're building the component. So we'll go back to our screen and we'll insert a button control. We'll also go to the custom section and we'll insert the Fluent to message bar. In our buttons onSelect property, we'll go ahead and reference the Fluent to message bar that we just inserted on the screen. We'll follow that with a period, and then we'll reference the notify function. We can see it's asking first for a type, so we'll insert notification type dot information. For the title, we'll insert title. For the message, we'll insert message. We'll enter 5,000 for the duration. For the link record, we'll set the link text to test link, and we'll set the link URL as google.com. For action 1 and 2, we'll just insert records that have the item key as action 1 and action 2, and the item display name as action 1 and action 2. Our full formula is shown here. If we select our button, that will call our notify function, and we should now have a message in our collection that we'll see when we start to build our component. Now we can return to our component and we can continue to build it. So we'll go ahead and move on to inserting our controls. First, we'll insert a vertical container into our component named Container Message Bar Component. We want to set the X and Y values for this container to 0. The width for this container should be set to parent.width, and we'll set the height to parent.height. We'll also change our border radius to 0 and our drop shadow to none. Next, we'll go ahead and insert a blank flexible height gallery into our message bar component container, and we'll name this gal message bars. The data source for this gallery will be col messages, which is our collection of messages, and we'll set the width to stretch with a minimum width of 0. For the gallery's height property, we want this to be dynamic based on the number of messages in our gallery. So we'll need to come back and change this after we set up our controls. For now, we'll go ahead and set the height to 90. While we're here, we'll also go ahead and set the template size to 85, and we'll set the template padding to 6. We'll also disable the scroll bar. In the advanced properties, we'll go ahead and disable the loading spinner by setting the loading spinner property to loadingspinner.none. Next, inside our gallery, we'll go ahead and insert a container named Container Gal Message Bars. We want the gap of this container to be set to 4, and we want to make sure the X and Y values are set to 0. For the width property, we'll go ahead and set this as parent.templateWidth. And for the height property, we'll set this to 80 for now. The first thing we can tackle is to change the color of our message based on the type of the message. We'll do this by going to the color property of our container, and we can insert a switch statement here. We want to switch on this item.type, and then for our first match, we'll insert notification type.information. For this value, we'll set it to RGBA 245, 245, 245, 1. And that'll be a nice light gray color. For our next switch value, we'll do notification type dot warning. And for this match, we'll do RGBA 254, 249, 245, 1. And this will be that orange color. Next, we'll do notification type dot error. And for this, we'll do RGBA 251, 243, 244, 1. And that just leaves notification type dot success. And for that, we'll set this to RGBA 243, 250, 242, 1. And that'll show us a nice green color. Now we also want a little bit of a nice outline to our messages, so we'll do a similar formula for our border color. We'll go to the advanced properties and we'll select our border color. For our switch statement, we'll use slightly different values so that we get a darker color for our border. So again, we'll switch on this item dot type, and for notification type dot information, we'll do RGBA 209, 209, 209, 1. For notification type dot warning, we'll do RGBA 245, 209, 184, 1. And for notification type dot error, we'll do RGBA 228, 175, 179, 1. And finally, we'll do notification type dot success, and we'll set this to RGBA 171, 214, 164, 1. And we'll close our formula. We'll go ahead and set our border thickness to 0.5, and that should complete our container. Next, we're going to insert a horizontal container in our gal message bars container. We'll call this container messages. The gap of this container is going to be set to 8, and we'll set the padding on all sides to 8 as well. We'll set the width of this container to parent.width, and the height is going to be dynamic once we start to insert our other controls. For now, we'll go ahead and set this to 40, and then we'll change the drop shadow to none. We also want to align everything to center vertically. Inside our messages container, we'll go ahead and insert 3 controls: an icon control named ICO message type, an HTML control named HTML message, and a button control named button dismiss. Starting with our icon control, we can do a little bit of formatting with this. For the height and width properties, we'll go ahead and set these to 20. The style of the icon should be filled, and we want the color to be based off of our notification type. Similar to our background color, we'll use a switch statement for this. We want to switch on this item dot type, and for the notification type information, we'll use RGBA 9797971. For the notification type warning, we'll use RGBA 1758234, For error, we'll use RGBA 162373771. And for success, we'll use RGBA 501103441. For the icon property, we also want to change this based on the notification type. So we'll use a switch on this item.type. And for the information type, we'll use the info icon. For the warning type, we'll use the warning icon. For error, we'll use the dismiss circle icon. And for success, we'll use the checkmark circle. For our HTML control, we're going to change our font size to 10.5, since this is the equivalent of the text from the modern text control. We'll remove the padding from all sides of the control, and we'll enable the flexible width option with a minimum width of 32. We'll also go ahead and enable the auto height property. In the text of this control, we'll go ahead and insert our different elements of our message from our gallery's items. We'll start with a $sign and then a quotation mark, and we'll enter the HTML span. For the style, we want the font weight of this to be set to 600, which is the equivalent of a semi-bold, and that'll be surrounded by single quotes. We'll close our span, and then in curly brackets, we'll reference this item.title. We'll do a closing span tag, and then we'll reference in curly brackets again this item.message. After our message, we want to display a link if there is one. So we'll enter an A href tag, and for our href, we'll put an equal sign followed by a quotation, and then we'll reference this item.link URL. After that, we'll enter a style tag. After that, we'll set the style of this href to a color code of 0000EE. And we'll follow that by a semicolon. Note that the color code all the way up to the semicolon should be in 2 double quotes. And we'll follow this by referencing this item.link text. We'll close our formula by closing our A tag. I'll include the text for this HTML in the description below. With that, our HTML control will display our title, our message, and any link that we provide in our notification. For our dismiss button, we want to set this to the icon only layout. The icon in this case will be the dismiss icon, and we'll go ahead and set the padding on all sides to 0, which is in fact different than it being empty, so don't be fooled by that. We'll set the height and the width to 20, and the type for this button should be transparent, with the icon style being outline. In the onSelect property of the button, we want to give the user the ability to dismiss the notification. We'll insert a remove function, and we want to remove from call messages this item. Now let's select our gal message bar container, and we'll insert another horizontal container named container actions. This container's contents will be end or right justified, and we want it to be centered vertically. We'll go ahead and set the layout gap to 8, and for the left and right padding, we'll set this to 8 as well. The width for this container should be set to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and we'll set the height to 36. We'll also change the drop shadow for the container to none. Inside this container, we'll insert 2 buttons, one for button action 1 and button action 2. We'll select both of these buttons, and we'll set the height to 24 and their type to secondary. Their font size should also be 12, and we'll put the font weight to normal. These will ensure that the buttons match the Fluent 2 documentation. Selecting button action 1, we'll go to the text property, and this should be set as this item.action1.itemDisplayName. In the onSelect property of the button, we'll reference our Fluent 2 message bar's onSelect event, and we'll provide this item.action1.itemKey as the item key parameter. We'll go ahead and repeat this for our second action button, being sure to reference the second action button's display name and item key. With both of these buttons, we want to ensure that their width expands to however long the text inside them is. We can do this using an HTML control to flip the text by 90 degrees, and the height of the HTML control will then tell us how wide our buttons need to be. To do this, we'll select our gallery item, so not inside of our container, and we'll insert a regular container named Container Auto Width HTML. We'll send this container to the back so that it doesn't interfere with any of the messages being clicked on. The width of this container doesn't really matter, but we want to make sure that the X and Y values are set to 0 and the height is set to 2. We also want to make sure that the drop shadow is set to none. Inside this container, we'll go ahead and insert our first HTML control. This will be called HTML Action 1 Width. For the font size, we'll set this to 16, and this should give us enough extra padding around the button. We'll remove the padding from the actual HTML control by setting all these to 0. For the HTML text, we'll go ahead and insert some code. We want a div with a style tag. For the styling, we want the display to be inline block we want to transform by rotating 90 degrees. We want the transform origin to be top left. The white space should be set to no wrap, and the font size should be set to 16. I know we set the font size in the controls properties, but oddly enough, the width will be more accurate if we set it here too. We'll close our div, enter a quotation and an ampersand, and then we'll reference this item .action1 .item display name. We'll insert another ampersand, and then in quotation marks, we'll close our div tag. Now with that done, we need to hide our HTML control. We can't set the visibility to false, or else the auto height property won't calculate. So we need to set the font color of the control to a transparent value. This will ensure that the control is visible, but we won't be able to see the text in any case. After this, we'll go ahead and enable the auto height property. Also, just another reminder, if you didn't do this already, we want to make sure that we send this container to the back so that it doesn't interfere with the user's interaction with the messages. We'll go to our action button 1 and we'll select the width property. For the width of this button, we'll set this as HTML action 1 width.height because again, our text is flipped by 90 degrees. The height of our HTML control is equal to what the width of our button should be. For our second action button, we can copy our first HTML width control and paste that inside the container. We'll rename this to HTML action 2 width, and in the text property, we'll change the item display name reference to action 2. Now we can go to our action 2 button and we'll set its width property as HTML action 2 width.height. Now there might be instances where our notification is not using a button, and in that case we want to hide our button controls completely. We'll select our action 1 button and we'll go to the visible property. We'll insert an isBlank function with an exclamation in front. So this will check if a value we provide is not blank. For the value to check, we'll insert this item .action1 .item display name. If the item display name for action 1 is blank, the button will be hidden. We'll repeat this for our second action button as well. Now we want to hide our actions container if both of our action buttons are not visible. We'll select our actions container and then we'll go to the visible property. Here we'll insert button action 1 .visible or button action 2 .visible. If either of those buttons are visible or true, the visible property of the container will then be true. If neither is visible, then the actions container won't be visible either. The height of our component will then need to automatically adjust itself, which we'll take care of now. If we select our gal message bars container, we want to go to the height property to make this dynamic, based on whether there are action buttons being shown. For the height, we'll insert an if statement, checking if container actions.visible is true. If it is, we want the height to be set to container actions.y plus container actions.height. If it's false, we want the height to be equal to container messages.height. This will ensure that the height of our container will adjust to the proper height if there are action buttons, and if not, it will only show the container that displays our message. Next, we'll go to our messages container and we'll set the height of this container to our HTML messages control .height plus self.padding bottom times 2. This will make sure that when our HTML control adjusts itself in height, that the container expands to accommodate that. Now we need to make the height of our entire gallery dynamic. We'll need to select our gallery and we'll insert a text control into the top level of our gallery, not in a container. We'll name this text control label auto height. For the text of this control, we want to display the height of our gal message bars container, plus the parent template padding +4 for some extra space. We'll go ahead and set the visible property of this label to false. Now we can select our gallery and we'll go to the height property. Here we want to insert a sum function pointed to gal_message_bars.allItems. And the value that we want to sum is the value of our label auto height.text. We'll need to add the gallery's template padding to this as well. This will ensure that the height of every item in the gallery is then totaled, and that tells our gallery how tall it needs to be to display all the notifications. We can then go to our component's auto height property and we'll set its value as gal_message_bars.height. This property is now what we can set the height of our component as, and when the component is inserted on a screen, its height will automatically adjust based on the size of our gallery and how many items are inside it. Now, when there's no items in the gallery, it's still going to show as a couple pixels of height, and that's because it's adding the template padding into our height of the component. So we'll insert an if statement at the beginning of our auto height property, checking if our gal_message_bars.allItemsCount is equal to 0. In other words, there are no messages in the gallery. If that's the case, then the height should be 0. Otherwise, it can reflect the height of our gallery. While we're formatting our component, we'll also set the width to app.width. The last thing we need to do with our component is to add the duration feature. We want the message to disappear after the specified amount of time, so we'll insert a timer control into the top level of our gallery. We'll name this timer message duration, and we'll send this timer to the back. For the duration property of this timer, we'll insert this item.duration. We don't want the timer to be visible, so we'll go ahead and set the visible property to false. We want to enable auto start, and then we'll go to the advanced tab. In the onTimerEnd property, we'll insert a remove function where we want to remove something from call messages, and the item for this will be this item. When the timer ends, it will remove the message from our collection. Now with our component done, we can go ahead and disable Access App Scope. We can see that that makes our message bar disappear. However, that just means that each message bar instance that we insert onto a screen will have its own set of messages. They don't have a shared collection of all their messages. We'll go back to our screens and we'll just go ahead and reselect our button on the screen where we initially built our collection. You can see a message appear here showing title, message, and test link. And then we can also see our two action buttons. If we go ahead and play our app, our timer should start in the background, and we'll see that in 5 seconds, this message disappears. If we go ahead and select our button again, we can see our message returns, and then again in 5 seconds, it should disappear. Let's look at a real-world scenario next. We have a screen here with a table pointed to a contacts list, and we have an add button here that takes us to a form to enter a new contact. When our form is submitted, we can see that we're sent back to our screen viewing the table of all of our contacts. In this case, we want to send a notification after we've navigated back to our table screen saying that we've successfully added the record. And at that point, we want to give the option to add a new record, prompting the user to keep adding records. We'll go to our table screen in this case, and at the top level of the screen, we'll go ahead and insert our component. You can see the name of this component on this screen is Fluent2MessageBar_2. In the onSuccess function of our form, we'll go ahead and reference our Fluent2MessageBar component on our table screen. We'll use the notify function to enter a notification type of success. And for the title of this, we'll say record successfully created. We'll leave the message empty. We'll set the duration to 5,000, which is equal to 5 seconds. We'll set the link property to blank. And for action 1, the item display name will be add another, and the item key will be add another, all lowercase. For action 2, we'll set this as blank, as we only want to give one option. So again, to recap, on success of this form submission, we'll navigate back to screen 3, which contains our table, and then we'll send a notify function to our Fluent 2 message bar component. This will be a success notification, and it'll say that the record was successfully created. It'll stay on screen for 5 seconds or 5,000 milliseconds, and it'll show one action button asking if the person wants to add another record. If we go back to our table screen now, we can go to our Fluent 2 message bar and go to the onSelect function. In the switch function of this, when the item key is equal to add another, then we want to reset our form and navigate to that screen again. If we go ahead and play our app, we can click on Add, and we'll enter in a new record. When we submit this form, we can see that we're taken back to the other screen, and we have a button here to add another. And if we select that, now we're taken back to our form. Let's look at one example of a container level notification. We have 2 containers on screen here, a smaller sidebar container as well as a main container. So in the smaller sidebar container, we'll just go ahead and insert our message bar component. We can see on this screen it's referenced as Fluent 2 message bar _3. In our larger container, we'll go ahead and add a button control. And in the onSelect property of this button, we'll call our Fluent 2 message bar found in that smaller sidebar container. For the notify function, we'll set this as notification type .warning. And for the title, we'll just say this is a test. For the message, we'll just say please disregard. And we'll leave the link as blank, the actions as blank, and we'll close our formula. Now when we select this button, we can see that our message bar kind of spills over the container's width. So by default, the component is stretching to the app's width. But in this case, since we're using it inside of a container at the container level, we'll need to set the width property to parent.width. And now we can see that the message is properly sized in the container. Just to show another example, we have 2 Fluent message bar controls inserted on one screen. So we have one at the top level of the screen, not found in any containers, as well as an example inside the main container. We have 3 buttons on the screen, one pointed to that app level component, and we can see that this is a notification type of error, and it's supposed to give an example of how the Fluent 2 message bar is fully responsive. These other 2 buttons are just sending notifications to that container level message bar, and we can see how that reacts with the buttons that are inside of the container. If I go ahead and play the app, this is in the larger screen size view. If we click on app level, we can see that app level notification. If we click on container level 1, we can see that the message appears inside the container. For container level 2, we have a different message, and we can see that that pushes down the buttons even further. I'll go ahead and switch to the mobile view, and we'll go ahead and select the app level, which we can see doesn't affect anything on screen. It just kind of shows up at the top of the screen. And this could be layered with more information as more notifications are pushed to the component. I'll go ahead and dismiss those, and then we'll click on container level 1 and container level 2. We can see that these are constrained to the width of the container that they're inside, but they do show the information appropriately. We'll go ahead and dismiss these as well. And that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this video on the Fluent 2 message bar. If you liked it, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next. I'll leave links to the HTML code that's used in the different controls throughout the video, so go ahead and reference that if you want to copy and paste that code. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video and have a great day.